Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. In the 1980s, when readership of U.S. newspapers was at its peak, no paper personified the big city tabloid more than the New York Post. With its sensational headlines, relentless scandal-mongering, its far-right wing bias, unsubtle racism, and loosey-goosey approach to the truth, it was as disreputable as it was irresistible. But the newspaper was not always so. From the 40s well into the 60s, the Post was a bastion of liberal progressive journalism, a training ground for enterprising reporters and editors who broke serious news stories and went on to hold prestigious jobs in the business. Susan Mulcahy and co-author Frank DiGiacomo, former editors at the New York Post, have assembled a lively and revealing oral history of the paper, chronicling its evolution from its birth in 1801 through its golden era in the 1950s to its takeover in the 70s by Rupert Murdoch, who used the paper to create a media empire that has literally changed the face of journalism. The book is called Paper of Wreckage: The Rogues, Renegades, Wise Guys, Wankers, and Relentless Reporters Who Redefined American Media. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I talked about the golden age during Dorothy Schiff. Tell me about that period.
Well, Dorothy Schiff was the heiress to a banking fortune. Her grandfather, Jacob Schiff, had been a very important banker and part of the German Jewish aristocracy in New York. And so she bought the paper in 1939, and her husband at the time was also involved. And they bought it in part to save a mouthpiece for the Democratic Party. Or she bought it. He didn't buy it. It was her money. And during the time that she owned it until 1976, it really was the liberal Jewish newspaper, not only in New York, but in the country. And it became well known for these groundbreaking investigative series that it would do. If you read The Power Broker, there's a lot of the Dorothy Schiff New York Post in there because they broke a lot of stories about the bad side of Robert Moses. There was a good side to Robert Moses, but a lot of what he did had been covered up, the negative sides of it. They also looked into Walter Winchell, Joseph McCarthy, a lot of demagogues, and they did some really important reporting, and that was when Jimmy Wexler was the editor. But the paper was about to lose money. It had never been immensely profitable, but it was about to lose money in 1976, and she just decided it was time to go. So her staff was just, and she had assembled this great staff of people. So many went on to great careers, many at the New York Times. People like Jane Perlez, Joyce Pernick, Clyde Haberman, Warren Hogue. It's a long list, really terrific people. And they were all part of the Post. But even those people admit, as Clyde Haberman said, it was not the age of Pericles. The final days of Dorothy Schiff, she didn't want to invest money.
Really cheap.
Really cheap. If you got a letter with a stamp on it that hadn't been canceled, you were supposed to steam it off and reuse it. No taxi cabs. She was offered the story of the My Lai massacre early on as part of a group of newspapers that were going to break the story. So it wasn't like it was just the Post and it was going to be prohibitively expensive. It wasn't that much money. Warren Hogue brought her the opportunity, and she turned it down.
Right.
So
I've also heard about the, I guess it was probably Nora Ephron who used to talk about the office at 210 South Street and what a dump it was and what a crappy neighborhood
yes.
they were in.
Well, when she first bought it, they were on West Street, and then in the late 60s, she bought, when the Journal American went out of business, she bought their building at 210 South Street. But both buildings were absolutely crappy, filthy, disgusting. But Dorothy Schiff always had a nice office, and she was famous for having these important people for lunches, but serving them a sandwich. And there were all these disagreements about, like some people said, oh, she only served a turkey sandwich. No, she served a corned beef sandwich, but it was only a sandwich. Even when LBJ came to her office, it was a sandwich.
Okay.
Yes.
So then enter Rupert Murdoch in 1976. How did the paper change?
It changed very well, yes and no rapidly. One person said it was like Sid Vicious taking over the Philharmonic. The first Murdoch Post was published on January 3rd, 1977. And at the very beginning, there were some headlines that could have appeared in the Schiff Post, but there was a takeover by a terrorist group, the Hanafi takeover in Washington. I think it was March of '77. There were a bunch of hostages. I think one person was killed. And Murdoch came in the middle of the night, and he actually, the headline was, "We'll behead them," if you don't meet the demands of the terrorists. And to people reading the paper, this was just shocking. The way it began to look different than the Dorothy Post Schiff. Some of the stories began to read differently. And then Son of Sam is what really turned things around completely, and the blackout. The paper couldn't publish the day after the blackout. The other two major dailies did. They used the presses of other newspapers, like on Long Island or whatever, the Daily News and the Times. But the Post published the next day, and the headline was 24 Hours of Terror. Mm-hmm. And A-Beam and various other city officials, Osborne Elliott, were furious at this. It just, you're throwing fuel on the fire, making it even worse. But Murdoch's attitude was, what are you going to say? Yeah. There was looting, there was all this violence. We're not going to sugarcoat it. You can, but we're not going to. So, but that's what happened. And there began to be some kind of skirting the ethics of journalism, shall we say, like making the story fit the headline that had been written in advance. And the paper quickly...
You talked about the wood. Right. I had never heard that term before, but that's the term for the huge front page headline.
Right. Which came about because when in the era of linotype, before everything was computerized, the letters on the front page were so big they couldn't be done in metal. They had to be done with wood. Mm-hmm. So, the wood was the clickbait of its day. I mean, the newspaper sales were everything to the Post. They didn't have a lot of people getting the paper delivered at home. They had some, but it was mostly newsstand sales.
So they needed a headline that would catch people's attention.
Exactly.
I remember, even when I was working for New York Newsday, which was, tabloid in a tutu, they called us. People were saying that the most important job of the editor was to decide what was going to be the front page story, the front page headline.
Yep.
So a lot more Australians on the staff came, influx of Australian.
And people from England, because Murdoch, Fleet Street people and Australians. Aida Alvarez, who worked at the Schiff Post and later became the first Hispanic woman in a presidential cabinet. She was the head of the Small Business Administration for Clinton. She said she'd never even thought about Australians before, like they weren't part of her mental makeup. And all of a sudden there were these guys with, and a couple of them had these weird perms, like with curly hair.
Oh, really?
And I don't know if that was a style in Australia at the time, but...
Stories got much shorter.
Oh, stories got way shorter, yeah. And the writers that had worked for the Post in the Schiff era would write as long as they wanted to, and somehow that would fit, right? I mean, they wouldn't go overboard, but it would fit. Now it became, if we only have 2 inches for that story, we'll just
chopped off
9,
the bottom.
Yeah.
Was there a Post writing style?
In the old Post, or?
No, we're talking about Rupert Murdoch now.
Steve Dunleavy, who was this infamous character as a reporter and as the Metro editor of the Post, he hated adjectives. He wanted a lively verb. He wanted simple sentences. He liked cliches. Mm-hmm. I mean, not everybody followed the Dunleavy method, but he had a whole coterie of reporters who really idolized him, and they kind of followed the Dunleavy method. Not a lot of flowery language. Very simple, very basic.
When I was teaching college journalism, I taught a course in journalism ethics for a long time. And one of the things that I would have my students read, we would go over, was I don't know exactly, it was the New York Times, essentially their code of ethics. They had a long name for it. And I think it was about 30-something pages long, because, what has always been most important to the Times is its reputation. Was there any kind of code of ethics at the Post that told reporters and editors what they could do, what they couldn't do?
Absolutely not. It was really down to the individual. A reporter, there were many ethical reporters there, and I would, pat myself in the back and include myself among them, but there were people that would never have crossed lines. And then there were a lot of reporters that did whatever was necessary to get the story. And here's 2 examples, one that's unethical and one that's ethical. Steve Dunleavy impersonated a grief counselor to get into a hospital room where the parents of the final victim of Son of Sam, and by the time they realized he was a reporter, he had really charmed them and they didn't care. And he supposedly ended up having an affair with the mother, but whatever. Totally unethical. He should never have crossed that line.
Yeah.
Yet again, some years later, Ann Bollinger was sent to Washington to try to get an interview with Ollie North when everybody wanted an interview with Ollie North during Iran-Contra. And she was just ready to give up, and she came up with this idea. She was going to do a feature on all of the guys who were guarding Ollie North because he was facing, death threats and everything else. So she does this big splashy feature, photos and everything in the paper. The next day, she still can't get an interview. And her editor, Al Ellenberg, says to her, okay, when his car starts to leave the house to go to church, because it's Sunday, stand in front of the car. And she said, I'm going to get arrested or run over. And he said, just do it, just do it. So she stands in front of the car. These guys that she's just done the story about say, Ann, get out of there. And they pull her to the side. The window goes down. Ollie North is sitting in the car, and he says, are you the one that wrote this story about my men? She said, yep. He said, get in. Spent the day with him.
Wow.
So she came up with this very creative. So that is also New York Post journalism. There were some really unethical things that just were, frankly, sleazy. And then there were people who were really creative and went about getting the story the ethical way.
One of the revelations for me in your book was that the Post's most famous headline, "Headless Body in Topless Bar," wasn't quite true. Tell me about that.
Yeah. There's still a little bit of debate on that. Once they came up with the headline, and there were Vinnie Musetto, who was an infamous guy at the Post, got full credit for the headline, but actually another editor named Drew Mackenzie was also part of creating it, and he does not get the credit that he deserves. But anyway, they sent somebody out to peer.
But basically, a torso was found in a Queens.
Yes, a lunatic
bar.
held several people hostage, murdered the owner of the bar, and when his niece showed up, not knowing what was going on, and he realized by looking through her pocketbook that she was a mortician, he ordered her to chop off her uncle's head because he wanted to throw the head away. The bullet in the head would not be connected to him. So this unbelievable, saga ensues after this happens. But when people said it was a topless bar, the Post needed to confirm this as they were running the story that day. And they sent a reporter up to peer in the window to see, and they decided they saw something that said it was a topless bar. So I always figured it wasn't really a topless bar, but I interviewed Peter Dunn, the assistant district attorney who tried the case in Queens. Mm-hmm. And he referred to it as a topless bar, and he said that there was a topless stand. This crazy guy, Charles Dingle, not only murdered the owner, but he raped this woman who was a dancer. So I think it wasn't like,
Well, the bear was what there's this headless body in this bar. Wouldn't it be a great headline if it's read, "Headless Body in Topless Bar"? So let's see if we can find a topless angle.
Well, I think it was more that there was some talk ahead of time that it might be a topless bar. Mm-hmm. I don't think they invented that to go with the headless body. I think that they just wanted to confirm that. I mean, they called their, reporter assigned to the police shack to find out from the precinct. They did do some due diligence, but I always figured it wasn't really. But then when the ADA said that, I thought, well, it was kind of a topless bar.
He got on board.
There was one dancer.
Okay. As you suggested, Murdoch hired some really colorful staffers, not always colorful in a good way. Could you tell me about several of them?
Well, Dunleavy was the most famous. His drinking, I've never seen anyone drink like that. He would, I once was down near the Post on a weekend morning to swim laps at a pool down there, and at 10 o'clock in the morning, he comes stumbling out of a bar and says, "Mulcahy, get in here and have a beer with us," whatever. And I said, "I'm going swimming if you're still, And he would drink, do these 2 and 3 day drinking, and then he bouts and he'd show up, fall asleep in a chair for a few hours, and then work. And there were multiple times where people thought he was dead. Like he would pass out in a corner and, a copy girl would run over and, "Steve's dead, Steve's dead." And then he would burst to life. And he was picked up numerous times. He was in a drunk tank at a hospital in the Village. And they called and said, "We have this lunatic here who says he's the Metro editor of the New York Post." And the city desk said, "Oh, we know who that is. We'll send somebody over."
He wasn't a particularly good writer in the beginning, I gather, but he had a nose for what?
He was a good reporter. I mean,
okay.
He was a good reporter. But but he would cut. I mean, one person said, and I think it's true, Steve's greatest strength was he would do whatever it took to get the story, and that was his greatest weakness. So he was a very good reporter. He was not much of a stylist. He got better as the years went on, but I never liked his writing style. It was tabloidy in a way that, I mean, there's some tabloid writers who had terrific style. His wasn't one that appealed to me, but a lot of people liked him.
Yeah. Behavior in the Post newsroom and in the Post building was the stories, the drinking fighting among the employees, sex in the news building, cocaine use in the newsroom, maybe even some drug dealing in the building, sexual harassment. Was this the Australian influence, or what was this
Well,
about?
some of it actually predated Murdoch, but it got a lot more outrageous after Murdoch took over. There was a lunatic guy named Alan Whitney who had been there in the Schiff era, and some of this behavior was evident then, and nobody did anything about it. I have no idea how he kept his job so long. He would send female staffers, usually young ones, panties and interoffice mail. He had this whole obsession with being spanked by copy girls and spanking copy girls. And he never bothered me. I mean, someone that we interviewed said that I went to Barnard College, that he didn't bother the Barnard girls because that's where his wife had gone to college. I said, well, maybe that's how I escaped. I mean, I'd heard he was a nut, but in doing the interviews for this book, I learned, some of this I had no idea, like the cocaine use. There were a couple of reporters, I mean, it was the 80s,
Right.
and there were a couple of people who were known to have a serious coke habit. But there were photographers who were, not just photographers, there were all these people that were dealing coke in the office. If you wanted coke, you went back, to certain people and they'd meet you in the developing room for the photos, whatever. I was stunned. I had no idea. I mean, it got so bad that the cops, who had a good relationship with the Post, sent the message that you need to put the kibosh on this, or we're doing a raid and somebody's going to get arrested. So
you worked for Page Six, which became wildly popular, gossip page.
Right.
How was it different from the traditional gossip page, and why was it so popular?
It wasn't associated with one person. That was the old style, and we're talking go way back, Walter Winchell, Dorothy Kilgallen, people like that. You had their picture, they had a style, everyone knew them as a personality. Page Six became the personality, and when it would change editors, the column just kept going because it also developed a certain sort of smart-ass, quasi-snarky writing style that was very popular, and it was also accurate. That's when, I mean, I think had it not been, it would have lost its luster very early on, but its agenda was to cover power, not just famous people, but powerful people. We'd always talk about Page Six, you should feel like you're being escorted down the corridors of power and you're listening in on doors and on the way there. And we covered Wall Street, the media, entertainment, high society. We covered all these different areas and did it with a sense of humor. But it was also accurate, like we broke a lot of stories. So
it was also so iconic that it didn't always have to be on Page Six.
Well, when I was the editor, and I worked on Page Six for 7 of its first 8 years, when I was the editor, they moved it twice to another page, and I had a fit. I said, it is called Page Six, and they didn't do it again. I had such a fit. But after Murdoch was forced to sell the paper in '88 to meet government regulations, then he bought it back in '93. And when he bought it back, Ken Chandler became the editor, thought that it was, he decided that Page Six could go where the news hole determined it would be. And I asked Richard Johnson what he thought about that. And Richard worked for me for 3 years, and he became a long-standing editor of Page Six. He said he was not happy about it either. I feel like it's called Page Six. It ought to be on Page Six.
Right.
But one of the people we interviewed said they felt that Page Six had become such a brand that it didn't need to be on the 6th page. But I realize that it's a popular brand, but I still think it should be on the 6th page.
The Post and the Daily News were probably the newspapers that were read by Black people in the city, people of color in the city. But the Post, it was not particularly friendly to them in its coverage. You had a lot of race baiting, negative reporting of blacks, little interest in crimes against blacks. the demonization of black youths, and very few black employees.
Yeah, very few black employees. I mean, that was meant. And Steve Dunleavy used the N-word once. Greg Morris, who worked at the Post for a few years, and he's a very good reporter. He just loved covering crime. So he definitely fit in with the Post agenda in terms of that. But Dunleavy didn't want him hired full time, and he could be. And yet Dunleavy treated some people with respect, but Greg obviously was not a fan.
Okay.
And when it's as though they knew they needed to have a few black employees, but they didn't go overboard in hiring.
Yeah.
And when there was a crime involving, a black victim, it would get a lot less attention than if it was, a white woman who lived on East 62nd Street.
Right.
So.
And better if she was an attractive blonde.
Exactly. Always better if she's a blonde. Always better.
Donald Trump got a huge amount of coverage from the Post before he went into politics. 20 front page stories about him between, 1988 and 1993.
Donald Trump sold papers. He and John Gotti was another figure, both of them later referred to as Teflon Don, who sold papers. It's interesting, though, Jim Wilsey, who was the editor of the Daily News, I mentioned this to him, and he said, well, back in the day, Trump sold papers when he was with an attractive woman. John Gotti didn't need to be with an attractive woman to sell papers. Now that's no longer the case with Trump, but Trump was calling reporters all day long. His media empire, his real estate empire, as we now know, had a lot of problems over the years. His companies filed for multiple bankruptcies. And I'm not surprised because I don't know how he got any work done. The number of people who I trust who are good journalists that wouldn't make it up, that said that Donald Trump was calling them at least 2 or 3 times a week, and in all different areas of the paper. So, but the Post did like him, and he learned a lot from the Post.
Ed Koch also got a lot of play.
Ed Koch was elected with a great assist from Rupert Murdoch. When Murdoch first came to New York, the thing about Murdoch is he's not as political as people think. He will do what needs to be done for his businesses to succeed. And if it's a liberal Democrat who's in power, he'll get behind that person. If it's Donald Trump running for president, he'll get behind that person. He came to town, it was the 1977 mayoral race, which became a very important race. Abe Beame, the incumbent, had been such a disaster with the fiscal crisis and the blackout. He clearly wasn't going to win. So Murdoch looked at Cuomo, he looked at Herman Badillo, he looked at a variety of candidates, and with a push from Dave Garth, the political consultant, decided that Koch was his guy. And he did things like put the endorsement on the front page, which had not been done. That went on the editorial page. And there were some trumped up polls. Joyce Pernick told us that she was asked to write about this one poll that she just thought was not legitimate. And it appeared in the paper under somebody's byline who didn't usually cover politics.
Yeah.
And she said she felt like an island in the middle of polluted water. She eventually left within a year. But yeah, there were things going on with and it was so bad that staffers at the Post got together a petition to protest the coverage of Koch's election to mayor.
Right.
But when they endorsed Koch, it made a really big difference. John LaCicero, who was a key advisor to Koch, said it was the thing that made them realize they could win. Because Koch had been and also ran.
The Post has survived newspaper strikes, bankruptcy, changes in ownership, yet right now its circulation is several times that of the Daily News. What do you think of the current Post?
I like some of its features and stories. It still has, I'm not a huge sports fan, but I recognize that they really put money into their sports section. I meet people in other parts of the country who don't read newspapers, but they read the Post sports section online. I don't like their national political coverage. It's obviously clearly biased, and I look at some of the stories and think, I don't read all of them. I can't read all of them. I start to, and I think, oh my God. But there are some really, some of their features are really good, and they do cover. The New York Times doesn't cover the city the way it used to, and the Post will sometimes cover local politics better than anybody else because the Daily News has very few resources at this point.
Right. The title of your book asserts that the people who worked at the Post redefined American media. Tell me what you meant by that.
Well, Murdoch once he had the Post, it was his first major acquisition in the United States, and he really wanted to make it here. He laid the foundation for what became this very divisive, one-sided media culture, right? The Post rarely gives you both sides of the story. It gives you the side of the story that they are behind.
Right.
And it's usually, if there is any
like
news,
Fox
News. So he took the template for the Post, transferred it to TV with A Current Affair, which was the first tabloid TV show, hugely successful, created many copycat shows. And then he started the Fox network. Well, that was part of the Fox network. And then he started Fox News. And Fox News eventually became so popular. I mean, people were stunned that there was this underserved audience of super, right-wing people that wanted to be preached to. And all of a sudden, MSNBC, which had been a bit more balanced, became sort of the left-wing version of that, although I would say it is far more fact-based than what appears on Fox. Not, there are a few good things on Fox, but mostly I don't watch it regularly, let's put it that way. So he really helped create this divisive media culture that it is ruling the way we get our news. And social media has enhanced that divisiveness and the, people going into silos and only reading or listening.
You read the paper that supports what you think,
exactly.
you watch the TV station that supports what
There's
you think.
There's no Walter
anyway.
Cronkite
Yeah.
on a network news giving you a balanced portrait of the news of the day.
You interviewed how many people for
over 240.
And a quote from one of them, I think, sort of sums up the thrust of the book. Without Rupert Murdoch and the New York Post, there's no Fox News. Without Fox News, there's no Donald Trump. And without Donald Trump, there would not be all those people dead from COVID. It was really a lively, very entertaining book. And I think a lot of people are going to learn a lot from it and enjoy reading it.
Thank you.
So thank you for writing it. I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to thank Susan Mulcahy, co-author of Paper of Wreckage, The Rogues, Renegades, Wise Guys, Wankers, and Relentless Reporters Who Redefined American Media, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Instagram at 121 CUNY TV, and you can watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For the City University of New York and 121, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.